everybody. I'm going to review Sons of the Forest. Let me give you a brief introduction as to how I look at video games and how I like to review stuff. I love video games. I typically rate stuff much higher than they deserve to be because I really like new and creative ideas. I really like newness. I don't like sameness. I tend to move on to games very quickly, and I tend to try to experience new things because I like new and creative things. So anytime a game does something, I tend to look at it and I go, well, what are the positives of this? The developers must have put a lot of time into this, and I feel bad if I ever insult them. So Forest is, or I should say Sons of the Forest is a unique experience, if you will. But is it a good experience? My opinion is that it's kind of boring and it gets memed into being something that it's really not. Now, I'm going to give you some tools to discredit me, because if you don't like my opinion and you do like Sons of the Forest, you can try to discredit my opinion based on the following. I never played the original Forest. I watched reviews on it. I played 9 hours of Sons of the Forest in one sitting for about an hour and a half solo, and then for the rest of it with 8 people. And in that time, I slowly found that the game wasn't well constructed and actually wasn't the game that I thought it was going to be. I asked people who had played the Forest, and I asked a lot of people their opinion on it, and I think fundamentally the problem with Sons of the Forest is that it's not the game that people make it out to be. A lot of people seem to think that the Forest and Sons of the Forest are a base-building co-op game where the enemies are constantly trying to harass you and attack you, and you need to stay alive, and they're coming out of the dark and trying to kill you and blah, blah, blah. And that's not really what the game is. The base-building aspect of the game as a whole is pretty much unneeded entirely. The game doesn't really play like base building at all, but instead you go into caves or you go into bunkers or stuff like that, and you try to find loot in there. You can find enough food, and water is pretty plentiful, so that you never actually need to hunt, you never need to trap fish, you never need to do any of that. That part of the game is basically completely separate from the actual main game. The main game is just delving into caves and dungeons and stuff like that and just getting loot. Unlike how a lot of people meme it or a lot of people say it, you don't base build, you don't defend. You can, theoretically, you can try to do those things, but there's no end goal of that. There's no real crafting system. There's no real upgrade system. You chop down a bunch of trees, then you make your base, and that's it. So you might notice that the gameplay footage should basically just be uncut gameplay footage. That's because I'm trying to show off just how the game really is played. Most of the complexes are actually abandoned, or if there are enemies in them, there are very few, not many at all. Some of the early dungeons and caves seem to have more enemies in them and more things to do, but maybe this is because of early access. Maybe they literally just didn't put enemies in the areas. But combat, at the beginning of the stage of the game, there tends to be more combat, but as you progress throughout it, and I only did that co-op run for 7 hours, so at best, leniently, you're going to have like 6, maybe 7 hours of content in the game. I was learning the game as I was going on, and at the end of 6 hours, people were dropping out of the game as we went on. We originally started with 8 people, and people sort of got bored and moved on because there just isn't that much to do, not really. And upon asking people, this is basically how the original Forest was. You can try to play it as a co-op base building game, but the reality of the situation is that's not really the emphasis of the game. And a lot of reviews and a lot of kind of memes and word of mouth make it out to be, that's what you do. So let's go into the danger. Some people will say, well, you build a base to survive the night, but unfortunately, you can just sleep through the night, and then there's no night. There doesn't seem to be any way to stop that, to prevent that. You just continuously sleep through the night. There's never seemingly nights where you can't sleep through it. The enemies on the overworld do get more and more difficult as time goes on. They start small little guys who can kill easily. They move on to medium-sized, large dudes, armored dudes. Sometimes some big tough enemies will spawn, but at the end of the day, it takes a long time for those enemies to start spawning, and you will very, very rapidly find yourself bored if you have any ability to build at all. There is an AI companion, and you can assign your AI companion to chop down trees, haul logs, stuff like that, and he is pretty good at it. He actually the AI is pretty good at it. That I really do like their AI companion. He removes a lot of tedium. But the thing is, if you have your AI companion chopping down trees, you can very quickly set up your base in 1 or 2 nights. I think ideally you could probably do it within 1 night, 2 at most. Even if you only have 1 or 2 people working on it, you can very quickly set up a defensive perimeter. Once you have a defensive perimeter up, that's it. Again, you don't build guns, you don't craft ammo, you don't do any of that stuff. You just defend your base. But what is the purpose of defending your base? To get food and water, you might imagine. But the issue with that is that actually the food and water is found very plentifully around the map. I very much ended up with surpluses of food and there wasn't really much to do with it, to be honest. I mean, what do you do once you have a surplus of food? You just run around the map and you do the objectives to complete the story. I'll get to the story in a second here, but the danger level is just pretty low. On the first night, it spawned a bunch of small dudes and they kept harassing us from the forest. I will admit the AI is quite ingenious. The AI of the enemies, and this is why I think this game actually will eventually potentially be good. The AI of the enemies is ingenious. They will harass you, they will disappear into brushes, they will climb trees, they will jump around. Once the enemies are in attack mode, it can be very, very difficult. I shouldn't say difficult, but it can be very frustrating to fight them. They very much do feel like a frustrating opponent. Now, you will, of course, be frustrated by it, but that's how they're intended to be. There are many situations where enemies are quite ingenious. I've had enemies walk into my line of sight and square off against me just for their buddy to sneakily stealth behind me and stab me in the back. Unfortunately, even with that example, I do have another complaint here. The footsteps of these stealthy enemies is almost non-existent. I don't think you can really even hear it. It felt really cheap to me that their ploy of having stealthy enemies was to just basically remove their footsteps entirely. That just kind of seems lame, does it not? I mean, he's stealthy because you literally can't hear him. But anyway, back to my point. The AI is good, but it doesn't go anywhere. You have no XP system. You don't loot enemies. None of this stuff does anything. Normal base defense games, you sort of, eventually you craft bigger stuff. You get, you advance somehow. But in Sons of the Forest, you don't advance. In fact, the only way you do advance is by going to caves. But as I've mentioned earlier, if you go cave to cave to cave, add in some compounds, things like that, eventually what happens is you're stocked up on enough food. Water, once again, is very plentiful. And that's it. The game's done. So what about night? The danger must be that at night you need to return to your base. But again, you can just sleep through the night. You can just put down a tent anywhere and sleep through the night. Yes, anywhere. In the bases, there are often beds or stuff like that you can sleep. In the caves, there might not be beds. I meant beds. There might not be beds and stuff you can sleep in, but nighttime does last. Daytime does last very long, and you can just make a tent and sleep through the night. I mean, you can literally just make it anywhere and sleep through the night, anywhere at all. At night, can you run around at night at least? At the very least, if you decide, can you just not sleep through the night and run around and maybe have to play safe during night? Can you sit in your base and play safe during night? Well, the answer once again is yes. At first, when we started to run through the game, we were very careful at night. We didn't do very much. We tried to play as safe and discreetly as we could. We didn't want to rustle anyone's feathers. But that didn't do anything. We were running around at night. We were deforesting the entire forest as much as we could to build our first base. We just annihilated the forest for our first base. The enemies didn't really retaliate. We went out and killed several of their camps. They didn't really do anything. We ran around at night. They made noises, but they once again never really did anything. Every so often a war pack came on us, but the war pack wasn't really that threatening. Death isn't really that big a deal. And the war packs actually tend to be very overt, meaning the opposite of covert, and they just sort of run at you and beat you down. And there's nothing really scary or anything about that. The scariness of the game just seems to be body horror, ooh, which if nighttime's not a danger, maybe the caves are a danger, maybe the complexes are a danger. Spooky enemies creeping out at you. Well, no, actually. The scariest thing I found with the game, and I kid you not, was the jump scares from the bats. Yes, the bats that'll jump out and go wee wee wee. Those ones are the scariest part of the game. Your flashlights are, you can get a flashlight pretty early. You get enough batteries to use it pretty much indefinitely. In fact, I think you actually get enough to actually just have it turned on 24/7. You can use your flashlight in your weapon. There doesn't seem to be any consequence. Even if you're using your lighter, you can generally see anything. Nothing really creeps out at you. The body horror aspect, it feels, to be blunt, it feels dated. That enemy has a stomach going up. It has a giant mouth going through its entire body. Okay. I mean, it's like, it doesn't even faze me anymore. Maybe I'm too old, but it just doesn't faze me. That enemy is two people merged into one. Once again, it doesn't faze me. It's, right? It doesn't do anything for me. So enemies don't really scare you at all. The scariest enemies, once again, are the lowest tier enemies that will constantly run through the brush, hit you, run away, run through the brush, jump through trees, run through the brush again, and you hear them, but you can't. It's so hard to fight these bitches, and the brush is everywhere, and it's hard to see through the brush, and they run up and they whack you. And they're not. I very, very, very rarely did I get killed by them, like 2 times most in the span of like 9 hours, right? But they're probably the scariest enemies, not because, oh my god, I might die, but because you're just like, oh man, they're really, really actually. Once you get 4 or 5 of them, they can be quite annoying. So there's just not much danger in the game world. You just don't feel much danger at all. That's honestly one of my biggest complaints. So is there a lot to explore? Well, also, no. Now you can say early access, but there's only so much you can say for a game where there's not really any reason to build a base. In fact, there's not really any reason at all, unless you want to intentionally just fight enemies attacking you. I didn't really see a purpose. We literally just left the base and never went back to it after like day 3. There was literally just no point to it. So we ran through, we tried to do the story. Well, we found out there's not much on the map to do. There's just, I mean, to be blunt, there's just not that much to do, right? But it is early access, so they'll add more later. The story is bare bones, but the thing is, calling the story bare bones is actually upselling it a bit. I think when people say the story is bare bones, they actually make people think, oh, it's a simple story, right? But it's not. It's not a simple story. There's basically no story. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it can pretty much be summarized by, at most, I think 2 sentences could summarize the entire story. And I mean the entire thing. The cutscenes aren't voiced. The characters aren't named. These are totally true. Some of the characters will literally just show up out of the blue and just they're there randomly. They're just there, and they're not named or anything. They're just there. And there's only like 3 cutscenes in the game. There's probably more, but yeah. And I mean, how many did I see? I think I saw 3 or 4 cutscenes tops, right? And so there's no story. There's no story to experience. So the gameplay, the issue is the combat is good. I do like the combat. It feels very weighty. Hitting enemies feels satisfying. Shooting enemies feels satisfying. Hitting them with a crossbow bolt feels satisfying. But that doesn't matter. 90% of the game is spent traveling point to point to reach the ending cutscene. And that's it. 90% plus of the game is spent just literally in a walking simulator. There's just not that much to the game. There's just nothing there. Is it worth your money? In my opinion, no. It's a great looking game. It's not well optimized. Frequent stutters, crashes, issues whatsoever. I had to cap it at 60 FPS just because it was causing issues to try to record it. So it's not well optimized. It does look pretty. The gameplay, the combat's decent, but there's not that much enemy variety. The enemies barely even try to attack you. I was playing on normal difficulty. I wasn't playing on easy or anything like that. Hard difficulty seemingly just makes enemies hit harder, though. That's what a lot of people have told me. I haven't personally played through a game on hard mode to challenge that. But if normal difficulty is that boring, I don't know what to tell you. And there's just not that much. You can outrun most enemies. Once you get over the whole jump scaring of enemies shouting at you in the night, you realize that during the night, most enemies are just shouting at you. They actually don't really try to attack you. They don't. They will shout at you. They'll try to jump scare you. They might hit you once, but they're never really actually going to try to kill you. The solo play might be harder. The solo play might be difficult and challenging. Maybe from that perspective, it did seem to spawn more enemies to try to keep pace with us having more people. I will give it that. But again, the first night was actually the most challenging. When we had the lowest tier weapons, when it was spawning, I think it spawned like 8 or 9 of the small dudes and ran around at us. That was the most challenging, and from there on out, it only got easier and easier and easier. So what is my point of this argument, and I hope you can see this from the gameplay footage I've shown, is that the game at present is basically a walking simulator with some jump scares. Unfortunately, that is my opinion. I very much do think that there's a good game to be had here, but I think what they need to do is, because the meme of the game is this base building survival game, in my opinion, they need to actually take the time to make it a base building survival game. They need to put more into the base building. They need to do more in this. Because that's the part that people enjoy. That's the part that people want. They want the base building survival game, and for some reason, it seems to be a very, very shallow dungeon game where you just run into an area, get in a literal sense, guys. It's a very extraordinarily shallow Metrovania. It's a very shallow Metrovania. You go and you find the rope gun or whatever it's called. Then you find the rebreather so you can breathe underwater. Then you find the shovel, and the shovel's not really actually required, but then you can get a key card. Then you get the advanced key card, and then you get the golden armor, and then you beat the game. That's actually the best way to describe the game. That's why my opinion on it is so low. That's why my review on it is so low. So in my opinion, just save your money. It's not the game you think it is. I think that's the best way to put. I think that's what I'll probably title the video. This game is just not the game that you think it is. I hope they can put more effort into it. I hope they can do more to make it the game that people think it is. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, I just don't think it's the game that people hyped it up to be. I don't think it's the game that people memed that it was going to be. And therefore, I don't really think it's that good of a game, which is unfortunate because the enemies are smart, they're clever, they feel cool. The enemy types, I didn't really see a lot of them, to be honest. Actually, that's about it. I just think the enemies are cool. I think the setting is kind of neat. That's about it, though. So, oh well. Leave a comment, agree, disagree, that stuff's cool. As always, you can subscribe to my Patreon, you can subscribe to my channel, you can leave a comment, you can do anything, but tell me what you think. Do you agree here? Have you played the game? Because I think a lot of the content on it, I think a lot of the coverage on it is really positive, and I, to be blunt, just don't think it deserves to be really that positive. So thank you all for watching. As always, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.